Wonderful. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really so lovely to see the seminar room filling up with names, with some familiar names, and we're really grateful to you for your loyalty and support of this series, and some new names too that I don't quite recognise. And if that's you, you're very welcome indeed. My name's Emma Smith, and this is a webinar jointly with the Oxford University English faculty and Oxford University Press's World Classics series. And we're using the launch of a new set of Shakespeare editions we're just using that as a pretext, really, more than a pretext, but as a very nice pretext to go through Shakespeare's works one by one. So if you're joining us for the first time, we have got 7 of these already banked on YouTube, and we are working our way through what will be 41, I think. Come to all, come to whatever you can. If you have a yen to read everything, read along with us. Today we are reading Merry Wives of Windsor. And I'm really delighted that Callan Davies from the University of Southampton is here to discuss the play with me. I'm going to introduce him in a minute, but just let's say something about the way the webinar works. Somebody just asked in the Q&A whether we could see you. We can't see you. I hope you can see us. Use the Q&A if you would like at any point during our conversation to put a question that you would like us to get to before we finish. We usually try and allow about 20 or 25 minutes for questions, and we've got about 75 minutes for the whole webinar. And what happens first is Callan and I will chat about the play and about the introduction he has written to the new Oxford World Classics edition, and the things that he has brought out and made fresh and new for us to think about. And then we'll perhaps be able to talk more generally in response to your questions. And 2 things I always say, but they don't stop being true. One is that in doing this project, I'm the general editor for the Oxford World Classics, but I haven't done any of the work. The work has all been done on the one hand by the New Oxford Shakespeare team. That's Gary Taylor, John Jowett, Terry Boris, and Gabriel Egan as the general editors for that big project, huge scholarly project. And Sarah Neville was the individual editor for the Merry Wives of Windsor. And the other thing I have had to do just is to pick smart people who want to communicate about Shakespeare, and Callan Davies was sort of top of my list. And I wanted Callan to bring his knowledge to this play, in particular because of a project I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit about the middling sort. So Callan, hello. I'm sorry, that's such a long introduction. You've probably lost the will to live. You speak now, but one of the things I wanted you to talk a little bit about is what you've done up to now, and maybe especially the middling sort.
Oh yeah, thank you for that introduction, Emma, and yeah, for the joy of having some time to spend with Merry Wives of Windsor. Yeah, thinking about it as a play. I guess some of the things that would have been foremost on my mind come out of a couple of projects that I had been working on up until the point at which I kind of turned to thinking of this introduction. One is a project called Before Shakespeare, which thinks about the early years of Shakespeare writing, the kind of theatrical culture that he comes from, I guess. And that certainly informed my approach to what was going on in one of Shakespeare's oddest plays by the standards of his canon. And the other, as you mentioned, was the Middling Culture projects. Both of these have active websites, so middlingculture.com. And the purpose of that project, which is led by Catherine Richardson, Tara Hamlin, and Graham Earl, is to think about not the super rich in society, not the kind of aristocrats, the one popular vision, I guess, of the Tudor world, which we get in things like the Tudors, the kings and the queens, and not the poorest in society, but the grouping who sit in the middle. It's kind of in the name. And we're really interested in the elastic nature of this group. You know, they're formed from people of all different backgrounds, so middling is very much an umbrella term for them. But the project is invested in recovering their creativity, across all sorts of things. So in terms of writing, people like Shakespeare were of this large group and moved through different stages and expressions of it. But it also includes skill and craft and creative endeavor in everything from painting to craftsmanship to furniture manufacture, and kind of putting those things together. And it's a really nice fit with Merry Wives, of course.
It's a perfect fit, isn't it? And I've two things already that I know we want to talk about. The idea that this is the strangest play, the oddest play in the canon. That's great. Stick with us for more on that story. But also that middling sort context. I suppose I like the middling sort. I think we would be middling sort, wouldn't we? We're not. So the middling sort would include sort of educated professionals who didn't perhaps own a lot of land or didn't inherit wealth, but maybe had a bit more money than they needed for absolute essentials, because that's one of the ways they drive culture, isn't it? And do look at that middling sort website. It's completely wonderful in terms of, the stuff, the sort of consumer revolution in a way that is part of late Tudor life. It's really excellent. I suppose it's always said or often said about comedies that they are about ordinary people. Um, but Shakespeare's comedies have got quite a lot of dukes and sort of rather sort of aristocratic seeming people as well as more ordinary ones. Is Merry Wives distinctive in its sort of class demography? I know we don't talk about class, but
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I suppose one of the things that makes it stand out as an old play in the canon is how close to home it is. I suppose for Shakespeare writing about England, it's nominally part of the history cycle of looking back to Henry IV, which is why kind of Falstaff, I guess, comes out of those plays and into the world of Windsor. But it feels very much like Shakespeare writing about the people around him in London, in Stratford, wherever we might kind of pitch that. Um, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what you think. We were chatting a bit about very briefly about Measure for Measure, weren't we? Just before this started, and I suppose there were comedies in which we see those types. We see the kind of world of Shakespeare in so many of them, but they're nominally set elsewhere in
Mm,
Vienna, in Greece, wherever it might be.
mm,
So I don't know if there's something distinctive about Merry Wives in just being quite upfront in saying this is actually a few miles up the road from where you're watching it at the
mm.
theatre, and you know these people.
And you mentioned Falstaff. There's a lovely bit in your introduction where you talk about the Shakespeare's history plays as midwives to this comedy play. Can you just sketch out for us the relationship, narrative or teleological or whatever, between those history plays and Merry Wives? Because one of the things we've learnt from doing this webinar is the fantastic combination of people who are genuinely coming new to the play and people who are, very familiar with it. So can we start with that? What's the relation between Merry Wives and the history plays?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's. I've just been my colleague Jakub Bojusak at Southampton. I know is doing some thinking about the chronology of these plays. It's been really
Oh,
fascinating.
I'd love to know more about that. Maybe we'll have to have a spin-off. But anyway, yes.
Yes,
Hello,
yeah,
Jakob, if you're listening. Be
yeah,
in
which is
touch. I'd like to hear that.
yeah, it's fascinating. And that kind of sense of the chronology and whether that's the right word, I think is really interesting because the history plays are written in slightly random order. They're not written sequentially through Shakespeare's career. But broadly speaking, Merry Wives possibly comes chronologically in between the two Henry plays. So we have the first part of Henry IV and the second part of Henry IV, sort of extending this story with Prince Hal at the centre of it before he goes on to become the continued star of the show in Henry V, and sort of interrupting this grand historical narrative, but running with its interest in the kind of places of the everyday, the kind of taverns of Eastcheap. We suddenly have this camera veer to Windsor, where Falstaff turns up at the start and is in a lot of trouble, and so audiences would kind of see him coming straight out of a play sequence that they would recognize. And I think there's been various stories about quite why Shakespeare decides to take this pause in between this cycle.
Yes. Should we scotch this one? Did Queen Elizabeth say she wanted to see Falstaff in love?
I mean, I think it's unlikely.
Probably not. No. Okay, you heard it here. No, not. It's interesting. We've regular listeners will remember I talked with Indira Ghosh about her introduction to 1 Henry IV. We haven't got to 2 Henry IV yet, which Owen Price is working on. So we have interleaved just by coincidence Merry Wives sort of within that sequence. So what's your sense of how the transition of those figures, how does that camera veer work?
Yeah, I mean, there's been one of the things I've tried to do as I guess introductions to plays do is to think about how criticism has looked at those characters over the centuries in this case. And I think certain critics see a major shift in some of those characters in people like Falstaff, that he's perhaps slightly more slapstick, slightly more physical as a comedian in Merry Wives. But I think that there are lots of things that probably connect a romantic comedy to the really kind of fluid genre of the history play. Characters are already getting up to kind of hijinks in the
Mm,
underbelly of London in 1 Henry IV. So I don't think it's a major generic shift to
mm,
then see some similar things
mm,
going on in Windsor. But I also wonder if I don't know, there's other kind of um, similarities about these plays' busyness and the kind of movement and emphasis on specific place that we get in 1
mm,
Henry IV, a play that kind of covers the whole country as it's dealing with rebellion and governance. And Windsor may be a smaller scope, but still characters coming on and off the stage, walking around the city, in and out of houses and drinking taverns. So maybe to us it feels like, if we're going to put a label on it as a comedy, as distinct from a history, that these things are quite separate. But I wonder if early audiences saw them as part of the same busy world of movement and yeah, sociability.
yeah, that sense of busyness is really striking. Could you have a go for us at the plot?
Yes. So this is one thing I should be able to do, and then you think, oh my goodness, maybe I've forgotten how this play goes. Now I've been
Mm,
asked. So Falstaff turns up at the start, and he's upset a number of the local justice of the peace who wants to have his day in court with Falstaff. Falstaff is typically uninterested in any of the kind of hurt that he's done, but what he is interested in doing is chasing 2 married women that he's espied in his brief time being in Windsor. And so he sends them 2 letters, the exact same letter to both wives, Mistress Page and Mistress Ford. And his kind of plot strand goes downhill or uphill, depending on whose side you are on from there. At the same time as that's going on, it's really a play of, well, I think in the introduction I hesitate to call them subplots because they're all kind of equal plots that progress through the play. But one of the women's daughters, Anne Page, has a romantic plot of her own. Her mum wants her to marry one person. Her father wants her to marry somebody else. She knows who she wants to marry, and that kind of rumbles along until the very final act too. And then there were a series of comical suitors who kind of overlap between all of these different plot strands as the play goes on. So everything kind of comes to a head. It's quite an episodic play, I think it's maybe fair to say, where the women, the 2 wives of the title, Mistresses Page and Ford, come up with these ways to test and provoke Falstaff as part of what they describe as a revenge plot. It's kind of like a revenge comedy. And in the very
mm,
final scene, they lure him out to the woods just outside Windsor, ask him to dress up as a mythical beast called Herne the Hunter, and um, stage a kind of supernatural. It's quite a Halloweeny end to the plot in some respects for a comedy. They dress up as fairies and haunt him and sort of fright him out of his wits as this kind of final punishment scene before
mm.
everything is resolved romantically.
That's such a great summary of it. And one thing maybe you didn't mention though, one thing you didn't mention is Ford, so Master Ford, Mistress Ford's husband, who is madly jealous, isn't he? And she decides to use this unwelcome, sort of comically unwelcome approach from Falstaff to what, test her husband, taunt her husband, somehow test out his jealousy, and that just seems so interesting because obviously jealousy, male sexual jealousy is such a Shakespearean theme, but it tends to be seen, well, I suppose I'm thinking back through Othello, which comes later than this play, but tends to be seen a bit more through the lens of the men. And in this play, it's sort of entirely through the really through the wife. It's the wife who frames it for us.
Yeah.
How do you is that is there ever anything is there ever any jeopardy, I suppose, in the comedy? Is there any sense that that could unravel, or that we could have a different kind of a play, or are they just in control, the wives, the merry wives?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is certainly something sinister under the surface of pretty much all of the romantic relationships in the play. Um, on the kind of Othello thing, so I was struck. I recently read Siobhan Keenan's biography, which has just come out of Richard Burbage, and I
I've
think
just got it here, actually. It's on my desk. Look, it's this, but is that going to be back to front? Yes, you'll
oh
have to
no,
look at that in a mirror. Richard Burbage and the Shakespearean stage. Yes.
yeah, and there's a section where Siobhan Keenan's talking about Burbage's career as possibly playing Ford, the jealous husband of Merry Wives of Windsor, and then again in Othello as part of a kind of series, as well as a jealous Johnson character, as part of a kind of series of these uh, jealous figures. And I think that you're right. You're getting something quite different in Merry Wives to what you then get in a kind of tragic hero way, because Ford is the opposite of a tragic hero in this. He's a bit like Falstaff in being the butt of the kind of comedic joke. But I was just looking through a couple of scenes earlier today ahead of this, and there were some. I mean, there were some really quite sinister throwaway lines in the play that I think bring Ford's jealousy into something that, yeah, the audiences might be quite shocked or triggered by if they've experienced similar domestic relationships. At one point, Mistress quickly turns up, I think for the third time, to beg Falstaff to come back and try again so that they can put their other revenge plot into place. And she says, well, you think you've had a difficult time of all of these attempted wooings, but Mistress Ford has been beaten black and blue. And so you suddenly get this kind of hit in this moment of the play that I suppose takes the floor out of the levity of
Mm.
it. Uh, in fact, the play is kind of characterized by simmering tension against women. When Falstaff dresses up, he gets disguised in a second attempt at wooing, so that when Ford comes in to sort of foil his wife and prove that all of his suspicions are correct, they bundle him out and say, "You've got to dress up as my maid's aunt, the wise woman of Brentford." This kind of knowing woman. And when he comes down dressed as her, the scene ends with this violent beating of Falstaff. But of course, Ford thinks that it's an elderly woman.
Mm.
So I think we could perhaps make theatrically it's difficult to make too much of those moments that might take out the force of the comedy, but they are undoubtedly really troubling kind of misogynistic outbursts. So I
Mm.
think Ford's jealousy really is central in that.
Interesting. As we're talking, it's reminding me a bit about our last webinar, which was on comedy of errors, where we were talking about the difference between a sort of slapstick or cartoonish violence towards the servants, the Dromios, and what that does for the comedy. And sometimes, but there's a possibility of a more realistic, I suppose, use of that violence. Yeah, and I suppose it goes with the community, um, this community of middling sort people and of place that you've already talked about. That, one of the things communities I suppose, depend on is um, I don't want this to seem absolutely topical, but on a sort of border management, don't they? Who is in and who is out, who belongs, who doesn't belong. There's quite a lot in this most English comedy about other voices, other ways of speaking English, um, who's part, who's part of the community and who's on the edge of it. Can you say a bit about those figures about Dr. Keyes or Parson Hugh?
Yeah, so the play is and this might be, sorry, not to get distracted, this might be something we kind of come around to, but I was thinking about the a possible topicality of this play, given that it's had in the past year and a half a fair few, or past 2 years, quite a few relatively high profile
Mm,
productions put on, whether there's something about this kind of moment um, that I don't know, does set it up as a might be a bit far to call it a state of the nation play, but something that is concerned with the idea of Englishness in the local community.
mm,
And figures, I mean, one way of looking at the play is to break it down into a series of people speaking fritters of the king's English, as one person puts it. So we have a Welsh character, the priest Hugh the priest. We have Dr. Keyes, who's a French doctor. Um, Often performed and indeed written on the page with kind of pronounced accents and mispronunciations that are cueing their difference from supposedly plain speaking English people in the play. So I think there is certainly a current and a way of staging this that is a bit of a laughter at people with accents, essentially, which is part of the comedy. Um, I don't know. I think I'm quite interested in the fact that there are also other characters who mangle speech and who get things wrong. That aren't, it's not a straightforward opposition between people who are Welsh, people who are French, who are not eloquent, and then the
mm.
body of proper Windsor people who are. Because actually, a lot of the Windsor speakers in the play are themselves deliberately or accidentally creative with language. So I think this one of my favourite things about this is a comedy is that all of the speakers are able to do quite surprising, often wrong-footing things with the English language. Yeah, yeah,
Yes, and I'm keeping an eye on the questions with the sense that maybe we can take them as we go along if they fit. And Mark, thanks for your question, which asks about why the play is in prose rather than in blank verse. And just I saw that question just as you were speaking, and I thought that could be an answer to it actually, that maybe it's a vision of prose which is more elastic, more open, more available for individual idiolect and sort of surprising forms of speech.
yeah. And I think there's like I don't know, is for lots of good reasons, there's a critical trope that when a character speaks prose, it suggests that they're maybe of a lower social status to someone who speaks in high-flown iambic pentameter. And that doesn't quite hold up in Merry Wives of Windsor because most people are speaking prose most of the time. And I think I don't know how you feel about it, but I think it's one of its appealing features is that we get quite close to the demotic of Elizabethan English, of the kind of sounds I don't know, I guess how Shakespeare would have spoken to someone in the tavern.
Yeah,
Um,
that's so interesting, isn't it? That gives us a sort of geographical proximity and a socio-cultural proximity, and then this linguistic proximity to Shakespeare's own time or to something more everyday, even though in other ways it's a very sort of farcical and mannered sort of comic structure, isn't it? The two letters, the two attempts at wooing, the two returns of the husband. It feels to me like something which is ca carefully constructed, but with this sort of episodic or artless feeling.
Mm.
In your introduction, I'm thinking now about what you said about the very end of the play when um, the sort of climax is this uh, almost a play within a play, isn't it? Would be one way to see it. That the townspeople are dressed as fairies and enacting this sort of folk ritual around Falstaff as Herne the Hunter. So there's a kind of weirdly fertility-ish kind of green man ritual or something. And you compare that with social rituals, often shaming rituals, things like the Skimmington ride. Could you put that a bit more because into a sort of Tudor context?
Yeah, yeah, and I'm struck by I see someone mentioned the recent Globe production. I
Mm,
saw a review of that in which the reviewer um, sort of deemed the final act, that moment that you're talking about there, as sort of irredeemably messy, sort of impossible. And I wonder if that's how, yeah, that's how we approach that kind of scene because we don't have that world of social ritual with us anymore. But I mean, some of the examples that I pull out are about yeah, you mentioned skimmingtons or caravari. So these rituals that are designed within small communities to police and manage adultery or illicit kind of relationships by putting them out of the open and shaming the couple at hand. And they could be really elaborate and highly theatrical. It might mean putting horns on the man and sort of parading him through the village whilst people ring bells and sort of toot horns and what have you. Uh, and I mean, even at the time Shakespeare's writing, this is in contention, but it's something that the audiences would have had some familiarity with. And I was really taken with some of the scholarship of people like Erica Lynn and kind of other scholars that many people listening will be familiar with, that thinks about the theatre as something rooted in the gaming practices, the kind of other ludic things that are not drama of the period, which include these social rituals. And yeah, and I mean the kind of the comparison with Falstaff tied to a tree with horns on his head whilst people skip around him as pretend fairies is really closely aligned, I think, with some of those practices that English villages would be doing up and down the country.
That's so fascinating because you can think of a a rather impoverished genealogy for the Elizabethan theatre, which is about um, mystery plays or mystery plays cycles or something, but which doesn't take on these non-play sort of ludic performances, which is a great term for them, that are part of other social bonding and sort of hygiene kind of um, uh, practices and presumably calendar celebrations of one sort or another. Do you think Falstaff is shamed? Is it the I'm sort of thinking about back to that chronology when we see him, if it's right that Merry Wives comes between the two Henry the Fourths, when we see him back in Henry the Fourth, is he a bit chastened or is he just the same as ever?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because Merry Wives ends invested in the idea that this practice has worked out and that community harmony has been restored, which is ostensibly the purpose of such shaming rituals. He
Mm,
comes to dinner at Master Page's house, and sort of everything is the order is all back. Um, I wonder if audiences leaving that might well be able to walk away thinking, "Huh, well, he kind of got his comeuppance, but it's still okay to romanticize his character as this funny knight." Um,
mm,
and if you then go straight in to 2 Henry IV, you've got the same old Falstaff. I think I'm really interested in the order of plays that people might have encountered, whether or not they got that in the sequence we would chronologically read it in. Because if you then go straight out of that into Henry V, which was written perhaps around the same time, you have Falstaff dies off stage at the start of that, and it's a slightly mournful note,
mm,
which might elicit a very different reaction in somebody who's really enjoyed this kind of the comical capers of Merry Wives. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know
mm,
if that's how modern audiences ever see or
mm.
receive that sequence, but
Yes, and I'm struck that we've talked a little bit before in this series about plays which exist in two early versions, and we've got here a quarto, haven't we? A sort of small format single play format of 1600. Is that right? And is it 1602?
No one.
1602. And the folio text of 1623. Am I right? Is the quarto text called Sir John Falstaff and the Merry Wives of Windsor?
Yeah.
So at that point, he is quite prominent in the way the play is being told, and maybe that is emphasizing um, a rather unexpected sequence or franchise. I mean, it's not exactly a sequence, is it? It's more like you call it a sort of spin out franchise, and it feels a bit more like a different part of the Henry IV universe. Um, and we're here focusing on it. We've got one point of contact back into other, but it's not clear whether this story is at the same time as or before or after. Um, but it clearly Falstaff was more a part of the way the play was understood when it was first printed than when it gets reprinted as part of the big book that wants to divide the plays by genre rather than sort of according to character, I suppose.
Yeah, and I suppose Falstaff has those historical legacies, even in the short term, in plays earlier than Shakespeare's company, with the kind of first wave of histories performed in the 1580s by the King's Men. So there's this kind of rolling. He's been a stage presence for some 20 years by the time, or so, or thereabouts, by the time that the quarto gets printed. So he has this real, the name or some version of it has some cultural
Oh,
currency.
that's interesting. So that's the sort of Queen's Men period before. Yeah, that's a really interesting part now of Shakespearean sort of biography and literary development that people may not have had the chance to catch up with. The idea that this pre Chamberlain's Men company, the Queen's Men, whose repertory we don't know in a huge amount of detail, but we do know that with these Henry IV and Fifth plays, Shakespeare seems to be reworking a Queen's Men play called The Famous Victories. Um, and again with King Lear, he's developing a Queen's Men play. So one suggestion about what every biographer loves to call the lost years of Shakespeare, where we don't have any evidence of what he was doing, and so you can fit in whatever you really want there. Some connection with the Queen's Men, it seems quite a likely feature of that period, I guess. Yeah, that's really interesting. So we've got a Falstaff who predates this play and post dates it in interesting ways.
I
And we
wonder if.
always used. Sorry,
Oh,
go on.
sorry. No, please.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just thinking aloud about that because I wonder if that's another factor of the play's oddity within Shakespeare's canon, in that the received texts we have are kind of in every sense, a post Queen's Men kind of style and writing. Um, yeah, quite distinct from those types of histories in some respects. But Merry Wives picks up on some of the things that we think we do know about the Queen's Men's canon, which is this kind of episodic patchiness with a lot of emphasis on the clown and on um, uh, sort of extemporized physical action and comedy, which all work in Merry Wives of Windsor. So we kind of have a play that's doing both, is looking back to those styles which are still current in some other repertories
Mm.
and other things that Shakespeare are doing. I don't know if that's pushing
Mm.
the link too far, but
Yes, that's a good point, isn't it? I mean, in some ways, the narrative of Merry Wives is a little bit difficult to follow. I've been twice to the theatre with people who have said there's a point where um, the French Dr. Keyes and the Welsh parson are in a sort of duel, and no, it seems to be just a pretext to get this sort of clash of these amusing speech patterns or put on speech patterns rather than um, really sort of particularly prompted by the action. And in some ways, it's quite difficult to work out what has prompted this, other than um, the sort of theatricality of having them together. Yeah, interesting. And I wanted to ask you about the women in the play. So Mistress Ford and Mistress Page, they boss the approach that Falstaff has made to them and their own households, really, don't they? Mistress Page brings now, does she bring about the marriage she wants for her daughter, or does the daughter?
Well, yeah, she does equivocate on it a little bit
Mm,
because I guess it's another moment of the kind of chaos of the social world of
mm,
Windsor is that she says she has her preferred candidate, um, and at one point her daughter says, "Well, you know, I don't think I'm inclined that way," and Fenton, who is we think her daughter's love match, says to the mother, "Well, you know, why don't you speak to her and see what she thinks, and maybe you'll allow her to make her own choice." And the mother says, "Well, okay, I'll speak to her, and whatever way she's affected, that way will I be." And then immediately the next time we see her, she's still on the same train about wanting her to marry her love choice.
mm,
Um, so in some senses, neither of the parents really seem to get what they
mm.
want at the end, but they're very happy to immediately pivot and say, "Well, you know, this is the love match, and it's meant to be. We welcome it with open arms."
Which is, I suppose, the part of the Shakespeare romantic comedy that we are used to, which is that the daughter usually makes her choice, sort of without knowing, excuse me, without her parents being present. That for whatever reason she is alone in the world and therefore makes a choice, but usually makes a very appropriate choice. Um, it feels like an element of romantic comedy that could challenge uh, the hierarchical norms by which children should obey their parents. But in fact, because the children make such good choices, it sort of rather reinforces them somehow. Yeah, really interesting. I'm just going to show the slide that I asked Callan to give us, so we can just think about maybe some of these themes in a little bit more linguistic detail, and then we'll come to the questions. I can already see there's quite a lot of questions about Falstaff, so we will be coming back to that. But uh, let me share my screen. Here we are. Let's just look at the lovely cover and there is Falstaff in his Herne the Hunter antlers, very beautifully done by the designer. And then let's have a look at this a little element of Act Two, Scene One, at the beginning of that scene. Why did you choose this, Callan, for us to look at?
I think in some sense, maybe this scene works as a kind of exemplar moment for the wider play. It contains quite a lot of the elements, at least that I find quite appealing about Merry Wives. It centers on the exchange of kind of written letters and this kind of hyper literate middling society where everything is kind of being put under people's doors to read and comment on. But it also hinges on the wit and the dexterity of the two wives of the title in unpacking this. And essentially, this is like an English literature dream because they're undertaking really funny and insightful literary criticism of a pretty bad poem and letter written by Falstaff and coming up with all of these kind of quite active um, responses to it as they plan their revenge of the cheek of this night.
That's great. I mean, Shakespeare likes the idea of bad poetry, doesn't he? All his poets are laughable, risible in all the plays, I think, almost. Can't think of one that perhaps in Julius Caesar, but then he's killed. So it's it's very interesting that bad love poetry or fake love poetry is such a theme of Shakespearean comedy. I love the bit about the Psalms to the tune of Greensleeves
Yes.
and the whale with the tons of oil in his belly. Um, the wicked fire of lust have melted in him in his own grease. I mean, that sort of fat, what we would now call fat shaming, that those jokes about Falstaff's enormous size, those are such a feature of the, I suppose that's one of the things that fits them in with the Henry IV plays too.
And he's such a, I mean, well, I guess it's a cliche to say that he's larger than life, but plays on that himself. I think about his, it's not in, it's in a later scene. He calls himself a man of continual dissolution and thaw, which I think is a brilliant, yeah, just poetically brilliant, but also a really
Mm.
amusing description of someone who's. Often, I don't deal very well with the summer heat, so I really sympathise with that. But he's so excessive all the time, in every respect.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for bringing us that. I'm going to stop the share uh, on that now, and I'm going to uh, move the next bit of the conversation sort of via some of these the questions that we've got. We've got about half an hour left in our time. Mr. Cox, I like your question. What are the connotations of merry in the title? I saw I've closed the window now, but we had uh, you are merry, so am I, in that wooing by Falstaff. What did merry denote? What kind of a thing was going to be expected from the Merry Wives of Windsor, do you think?
That is a really great question because I feel like it gets to the heart of both what that scene is doing and what the play, I guess what the play is debating. In the merry in the sense of having fun, of license to have fun, of not to be kind of strict and working and observant, is understood very differently by the two wives than it is by Falstaff. So for Falstaff, Merry is a kind of license that allows him to read into Mistress Page and Mistress Ford. I can't remember exactly how he puts it just before that scene, but a kind of general liking towards him,
Mm.
or words to that effect. So he sees it as a risky flirtation. Is
Yes.
what
So
Merry
they're up
sees.
for it. That's merry means sort of up for it, doesn't it? Or that's what he chooses to think. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Hence, sort of legitimizing his approach. But they try to reclaim, I suppose, that sense is probably how we'd put it today, to reclaim the word of merry as something that can be, yeah, you can have fun, but you can still be honest and
Mm.
honest too, which is the other kind of key word. It could be called the honest wives of Windsor in many respects too. So I think that question gets at the very staging and point of the play as to quite how you set that up. But certainly, I think the women would like to answer that question differently to to how some of the other characters might.
I feel as if it's a play in the staging. I didn't see the most recent Globe production, but I did see it at the Globe not very long ago, like about 2 or 3 years ago, I think. And I saw it in the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford. And that production, I remember one of its really likable things. It was set in a modern, sort of slightly Abigail's Party, suburban um, milieu, which I suppose is the equivalent of the middling sort. And what I loved about it was that the wives just laughed together. Falstaff would be bundled out in the buck basket with all the dirty laundry, or, pushed out dressed as the wise woman of Brentford. And then they would just absolutely collapse on their sofa, crying with laughter. And it was, I mean, it isn't quite the famous Bechdel test, that, oh, do women, is this a film where women, talk together about something other than men? It doesn't quite fit that because it is all around Falstaff, but they do seem to have fun and scenes together which are witty and enjoyable in a way which is perhaps again slightly different from the romantic comedy of Shakespeare that we're used to.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. I love the I think I think also in a recent Globe production, but going back historically to some 20th century RSC, productions where they choose to set that letter writing scene that we looked at briefly
Mm,
in somewhere like a hairdresser's. So it is
mm,
this space of kind of women's um, kind of conversation, and to some senses a slightly private space where
mhm,
Falstaff's unlikely to barrel through the door,
mhm.
and it gives a kind of power to their merriness and their friendship with each other. Um, yeah, yeah.
That's great. So we've got a few questions about Falstaff that I want to just pick up. So John Green asks, was the character of Falstaff so popular that Shakespeare was almost compelled to give him a starring role, maybe like a TV or film spin-off? And then Rohit asks, does Falstaff ever make an appearance outside of the Shakespeare canon, given his popularity? Also interesting that just like how Falstaff gets invited back to the community at the end of the play, we as an audience are keen to keep seeing him return on stage, even after he dies. I mean, he's rejected at the end of Henry IV. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Rohit. And then the description of his death is in Henry V. Yeah, they're um, really interesting questions about Falstaff. We've talked, I know, about him already, but is there anything you want to add to that sort of phenomenon, Falstaff phenomenon?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess that what we were saying earlier about him existing both within the Henryverse of Shakespeare, but also a little bit beyond it, to in some senses represent a type, a kind of character type that was obviously very appealing. And I wonder if, yeah, I know this is still debated in criticism and a little bit up in the air, but the sense of whether or not Falstaff as a character is also tied to a particular performer when Shakespeare's writing. So perhaps to Will Kemp, the famous clown of the Chamberlain's Men, who left at some point at the end of the 16th century, possibly around 1599. I know that there's some theories that the reason he doesn't appear at all in Henry V is maybe because the actor for whom Falstaff was written is no longer with the company. But that's also been debated. But yeah, that question that we just heard there about his appeal outside of the Shakespeare canon might also be about the skill and ingenuity of the performer themselves. And
Mm,
I also saw that wonderful OSC production last year, and I thought, as often with a really strong Merry Wives, or or performance of Falstaff in general, it's if the actor can do that job of being the larger than life character, that's part of the skill as well as the kind of brilliance of the words themselves. So yeah, I
mm.
wonder if Will Kemp might want to answer that question.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a couple of questions. Let's ask Morris this question, which sort of gets to the meat of this. Can you ever forgive Shakespeare for writing the uninspired Merry Wives of Windsor? Tell us what you really think, Morris. Or to put it another way, as James Shapiro asks, how did Shakespeare go from writing the Merry Wives of Windsor to writing a play as inspired as Hamlet? That's such an interesting question, with a lot of assumptions that I suppose we might want to argue about. But what would you say to Morris, Callan?
Think, I mean, it's a bit of a get out of jail answer, but it's a bit of a horses for courses answer, really, which is, Shakespeare, 1598. Another way of contextualizing why he would take a break from the history to write Merry Wives is because it's a play style that was in fashion at the time. So audiences clearly did enjoy the episodic comedic nature of this play. So our whilst we might value in poetic terms after that sort of many centuries of criticism of Shakespeare's beautiful verse, something like Hamlet, which pushes that philosophical introspection and its artful writing to the extreme at a greater price than we do something like a text like Merry Wives. Um, yeah, I wonder if contemporaries were quite happy to sit with them as two very, very different things that are doing what they're trying to do quite well. I mean, we chatted a little bit about the theatricality of Merry Wives, and it's a play that maybe performs better than it reads on the page, and it lives whilst it's alive. So if we're comparing those two plays in the study, they look radically different, but on the stage, they're doing different things. Maybe I don't know. How
Yeah,
would
that's
you?
a great point. I mean, you could make the argument, couldn't you, that Hamlet is is sort of better on the page, or has gained a particular reputation and weight through reading and analysis, which isn't perhaps quite so available to readers of Merry Wives. I mean, I think reading comedies is actually more difficult. I would say, for anybody who is, using this webinar a bit to read along. I think there are often pages of a comedy that you look at, and you can see that, you can perhaps see that they're being funny, or you can see that this is back and forth banter, or that there is some rude or suggestive joke about this particular set of sounds or words or something. But I think it's a difficult job, um, uh, sort of understanding or explaining why how these plays work at the level of the line often. And Merry Wives is even harder because we've got this non-standard English forms. I mean, reading dialect, as it were, as anybody who's read Wuthering Heights will remember, is very annoying. I mean, it's wonderful it can be wonderful to hear.
Yeah.
I think it is a get out of jail answer, but it does seem that Shakespeare wanted to write both of them, and in fact wanted to rewrite both of them as well, because they both exist in these, but both plays exist in different forms that suggest, uh, perhaps that they had an ongoing life, or they had more than an occasional life.
Mhm. It's interesting that Margaret Cavendish wrote one of the earliest critical essays on Merry Wives towards in the 1660s, I think it was, um, and she really values Merry Wives of Windsor as a kind of exemplary text amongst the canon. So those kind of critical sensibilities are different from generation to generation. So maybe, yeah, and maybe as somebody who saw it much more often in performance, back in the 17th century than we might see it now, had a
Mm.
different appreciation of it. I don't know.
Hmm. Great. Thank you for asking that. Uh, um, Patricia has asked about the art of wooing, as Ford calls it in 2-2. Is Fenton the character who masters this art? And she points out, just as Mark had pointed out previously, when saying that this is a play with a lot of prose, that Fenton has speeches in blank verse, and that he's the only one who succeeds in his romantic pursuit. This is a question that comes to us from Tübingen. Very pleased to have it indeed.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, yeah, I mean, I wonder, in some senses, he is the successful wooer of the play. So
He's not very nice, is he?
yeah,
I know that one is
you're right.
supposed to have more sophisticated responses to Shakespearean characters. I do know that. I know he's not a real person. I know that also. But if he's our romantic hero, as Patricia's question prompts us towards, he's slightly dubious, isn't he? He's not. It's not a joyful recognition.
I mean, at one point in the play, I think in precisely, it might be that very scene, Anne questions him about his motivations. You know,
Mm,
she's still. I guess I slightly mischaracterized it earlier by saying that her mum wants one person, her father wants another person for her, and she wants the middle person. But actually, she doesn't quite know just yet
mm,
at the start of the play. She kind of works her way through that. And Mistress Quickly, another character, takes credit for persuading her in that direction towards Fenton. But in his response, he says, well, you know, to be fair, the reason that I did start wooing you is because your father is well off. However, now I've spoken to you a little bit, I think you're great. And if
mm.
that's the romantic high speech of the play, yeah, it's not quite up there with the with the great lovers of literature. So he's definitely, I'd say, a problematic romantic figure. Yeah.
Yes, and I'm thinking here about Mark's question. Is this play the closest of Shakespeare's plays to the style of Ben Jonson? And that's a really interesting question. And there's lots of the humours plays every man in and every man out of his humour. That was one of Johnson's great additions to comic scene, wasn't it? That these are characters um, motivated by and sort of embodying a particular characteristic or humor, and that's part of their. They can hardly be any different, and that's part of what's so funny about putting them all together. But I'm just thinking about. I mean, Johnson's never very interested in the romantic couple. Is he? He's more. Uh, I mean, in Volpone or in Alchemist, or they're sort of around the edges,
Yeah.
and there's a sort of nod to, yeah, this is how comedies end, but they're not. They're slightly a dull part of the plot in a way that isn't so typical of Shakespeare
Yeah.
elsewhere.
Yeah, maybe that. I mean, I do have actually have some thoughts on Ben Jonson as Shakespeare. The dating of this of Merry Wives isn't precise by any means. But one thing we do know, or as far as we can say we know, is that Shakespeare was performing in Every Man in His Humour in mid to late 1598 in around September, at the time at which it's highly likely that Merry Wives was also in the repertory. So he's kind of going back and forth between either revising or writing, depending on when we want to pin the date, Merry Wives, whilst speaking some of the kind of Johnsonian humours lines in the curtain. So in the Curtain Playhouse. So I think that's a great question, and I think they're definitely kind of in dialogue there, and maybe that does, as you say, Emma, explain the slight change in plotting and emphasis for this comedy, in distinction from his other comedic arcs.
Yeah, that's just more and more interesting, isn't it? That if you're an actor learning learning the words, if you're Shakespeare the actor learning the words of Johnson, does Shakespeare the writer start to sound more like Johnson even without sort of really knowing it? And how close are we to the play that is sometimes projected as an initial collaboration between Shakespeare and Johnson
Mm.
at the turn of the 17th century? Yeah, that is a really great question. A really, really nice answer to that, Callan. Thank you. Um, I've got let's stick with that point maybe about genre. Another Mark is asking, Mark A this time, how does revenge comedy relate to revenge tragedy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I suppose in some senses less of a, would you say, Emma, less of a fixed, we would be happy to label a play as a revenge tragedy, but revenge comedy is a little bit more of a gloss on the uh
Yes,
bigger
I think I,
genre.
I think I'd agree with that, really. And in a way, it's a sort of paradoxical term almost, isn't it? Because it feels as if revenge and comedy are pulling in different directions. So it sort of engages that paradox. Yeah, I think Mark's right to call us to speak a bit more about that. I don't think it really is an established genre, but what's so interesting, I suppose, to me about what Callan was saying earlier is the way the play sort of skirts around a darker set of outcomes or a darker set of possibilities, and perhaps generically that would be one of them. I think that links a little bit with Giacomo's question at the end, who uh, asks us to say something about witch and witchcraft. The Merry Wives, I feel the Merry Wives are very close to performing witchcraft in how they conceal Falstaff and dress him as a witch, thereby producing a witch, and in their connection to the old woman branded as the Witch of Brentford. I suppose that does link a little bit with what we were saying about the um, ritual magic at the end of the play.
Yeah, and I suppose that sense of I like the linking of those different scenes in that question. Um, And maybe it goes back to what we started talking about, which is where community, where women have status and power and honesty in communities. And some of the recent studies in kind of social history around witchcraft have looked at that complicated border between people who practice medicine or I guess even kind of fortune telling and those sorts of things,
Mm,
for which wise woman is often used as an elastic term. And there were plays
mm,
about similar plays. So Mother Bombi is a play from a little earlier than Merry Wives that's really similar in that regard about somebody who is a wise woman and who goes through the play mending romantic problems. Um,
mm,
and this can be a source of agency for women, but it's also policed and it's a
mm.
precarious position. So I think that you could probably get something very, very interesting out of yeah, out of the way that the wives' behavior might be perceived by some of the more hostile men in that community at the time.
Yes, I'm just remembering now as you talk about that, Callan. There's in a Japanese library near Tokyo. There is a an annotated copy of Shakespeare's first folio, the first collected edition of the plays from the 17th century, and it's been annotated by rather a dour person who's gone through the plays with a lot of um, commitment and hard work, pulling out quotations and writing them in the margins and doing a kind of summary of what's going on. And I'd completely forgotten, but what you're saying reminded me of it, that he is very, very down on the Merry Wives and thinks that, this is they're much too merry, I suppose, much too sort of froward and, chatty, and they don't behave as women ought to behave. Um, so that does suggest that for some reader, perhaps a very particular one, they've already transgressed, the line that you're talking about. They are transgressing by taking agency in the plot and so on. So yeah, the witchcraft point is a really good one. And again, it's almost a bit like the revenge tragedy, revenge comedy plot point, isn't it? It's about how many of these serious and perhaps rather dangerous or dark elements you can put into the comedy and still have it as a comedy.
Mm,
Anna's got another of those, I think. Thank you, Anna. People today sometimes shy away from this play because of the fat shaming jokes, as you and others called them, sometimes cut them entirely. How do you feel about that choice and those jokes' place in the theatre and in casting today?
mm. That's a great question.
I
It's
don't feel that it, I don't feel at the moment, perhaps it's because sort of fat positivity is still rather a marginal identity group, if you like, perhaps particularly for men. I don't know why I say that, and I probably don't know enough to say it. What I was going to say, Anna, is I have not encountered a feeling in casting that this is a part for a fat man and a fat man must play it. So either Falstaff's, as the one we saw, excuse me, that we were talking about at the Royal Shakespeare Company with the very funny wives, who was a big man, but not a sort of round one particularly, or they're in a fat suit, aren't they?
mm,
So there's
yeah.
not there isn't a sort of physical authenticity as there is with other sort of identity types in casting.
There's something kind of pantomimey about it, isn't there? Where a lot of those similar kind of types and body types and the idea of say a large man in a dress as the fairy godmother or something like that.
Mm,
Um, that maybe there's a kind of a parallel English British theatrical tradition that gives continued license
mm,
and a touch point for those kind of slapstick slapstick approaches
mm,
to things like size.
mm.
I don't know.
You're right, though, Anna. There's a lot of there's a lot of ways that this play trades on, sort of difficult, casually ethnic, ethnic jokes, or nationalist jokes, and this center one about sort of body shape, um, and it is, yeah, very sort of difficult to know what to do with that. I think all productions, my sense is, to generalize widely, I think all productions have to cut some jokes now, either because primarily because they're incomprehensible, but or because they make a casual allusion to something which we don't feel uh, um, is anymore acceptable with that level of casualness. It might be acceptable to deal with it more, um, in a more serious way. Let's just take a couple more um, questions. Claire agrees about Falstaff and Hal's episodes in on the page. Really difficult, but can be great in performance. Thank you, Claire. Paula, it's lovely to see you. What do you think about the cross-dressing compared to female characters' use of the same resource in other plays? Isn't it a failure in some sense? Yeah, apart from in the underlying sense that this is a theatre of male actors playing all the roles, men don't really dress as women, do they, in within the fiction of Shakespeare's plays? And Falstaff is exceptional in that.
Yeah, and actually the play ends with two other instances. It's just that they're quite extra textual. They're not as spelt out on the page, but in the very final scene when Anne is trying to marry Fenton, and the mother says, well, my preferred person's going to wear white, and the dad says, my preferred person's going to wear green. Please take them off and marry them. And actually, they end up getting fake married to two young men. So there is a kind of pattern of that type of cross dressing in Merry Wives, used maybe to very different ends. Um, but yeah,
Yes, that's great. If you're looking for another um, queer marriage, remember that Todd Borlick and I talked about the end of As You Like It and whether the line ought to be, from Hyman, join his hand with his. And Todd and I talked about how that had been an argument really in the editing of the play. And Todd felt that it was a very valuable reminder of a kind of non-heteronormative ending. This has a different example, but a really interesting one. I'm going to take Jean's question as the last one, I think, unless anybody wants to squeak in another one. Um, Jean asks about, we're still at the end of the play, about the pinching. Was that something demeaning to be done for someone? You're right, it's got a childish feel to it now, hasn't it? Pinching.
yeah, that's a good. I don't know about the whether there's a social. I don't know whether there's a kind of social interaction associated with pinching. Um, but I think I've always sort of understood it as part of the fairy, the supernatural, to pick up on that earlier question, nature of the scene, that these obscured, it's supposed to be in the middle of the night or midnight, that these obscured fairies are coming out of nowhere to kind of make him feel like he's being attacked by airy spirits. Yeah, a bit like a sort
Yeah,
of.
so pinching is the verb, isn't it, for that Caliban uses in the Tempest. So there's obviously some sense that it's a bit you're being pinched by an unseen hand. Yeah, it's a really good question there, Jean. Really, really good way to end that. Um, Oh, Ari's left a great sort of
Mhm.
googly till the end. Let's read it out, and we may not be able to get to it. Ari, it's good to see you. Thank you. Regarding Paula's question about cross-dressing, I wonder what you make of Falstaff's line to Ford. Come, I cannot cog and say thou art this and that, like a many of these lisping hawthorn buds that come like women in men's apparel and smell like Bucklesbury in simple time. I've puzzled over them myself. Cross-dressing in Shakespeare we know about, but cross-smelling. Well, isn't doesn't the whatever he is at the beginning of Henry the Fourth, Part One, doesn't he smell the one, the sort of dandy who Hotspur is so annoyed about on the battlefield? I feel as if he smells very perfumed, and that's part of the affront to masculinity that Hotspur feels.
Yeah. Well, you can kind of imagine this isn't really answering Ari's question, I don't think, but you can kind of imagine this line being directed to certain people in the playhouse who are dressed up like the sort of yeah, like the sort of people that Falstaff's mentioning there in particularly modish clothing with the most exotic smells that are
Mm.
repeated throughout the play from things like peppercorns and what have you. Uh, yeah,
Mm.
and that Falstaff is quite opposed to this delicate pomade and what have that people are wearing. Mm.
Yes. Do you remember that moment in the Globe production where he's going to the wives and he just gets out some horrible old bit of toothbrush from his inside jacket pocket and just sort of gives his teeth a bit of a, and he seems he is being depicted as very a bit low on personal hygiene, whereas perhaps he's a bit he's surrounded by others. Yeah, thanks, Harry. That was a great question to come in with at the end. Um, uh, Callan, I'm going to ask you in a minute for one suggestion. I'm sorry, I didn't warn you of this. One or two suggestions of what people might do next if they want to do more follow-up, anything that we've talked about, any production or book or anything that you would particularly recommend. So I'll get you to do that in a minute. Just to say, for housekeeping, we will meet on the first Monday of November, and our play is Henry VIII or All Is True. And Laura Wright from the University of Newcastle will be talking about her introduction to that play. So Henry VIII or All Is True. And in December, our play is Romeo and Juliet. Hannah August will be joining us in the middle of the night from New Zealand. So do get ahead if you can, and do look out for the invitation and come and join us. So, Callan, what would you suggest to people who might want to follow up on Merry Wives now?
I guess I would, in kind of critical terms, there's some brilliant work done on that play and its kind of wider criticism, the wider criticism and world of the play by writers like Iman Shia and Catherine Richardson. So I would have a look at some of their work, both in print and kind of online. Um, and yeah, for those, if I'm allowed one final pitch, please do have a look
Yes.
at middlingculture.com.
You
We
have a
have
look at
resources on that.
middling culture. When does Midsummer Night's Dream come out, Rosie? That's a very good question. Midsummer Night's Dream that Vasha Panjwani has done her introduction for is in production. So I think we've got it on the roster for 2026. So look out for that. Iman, it's lovely that you are here and lovely to give you a shout out in this context. Brilliant. Thank you all for being here. Thank you very much indeed. We really enjoyed talking about Merry Wives of Windsor with you, and just remains for me to thank Callan very much and to thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you.